So tell me about your background.
Yeah, I'm a professor of religious studies, and I focus on religion in Latin America. I have 6 books published, and my latest book is on Santa Muerte. It's called Devoted to Death, Santa Muerte, the Skeleton Saint. Let me show it to you. And one of the reasons why you're talking to me right now is because this came out in 2012 and was the first academic book in English on the Santa Muerte movement, which is now the fastest growing new religious movement in the entire Western world, with an estimated 12 million devotees. So I wrote the first academic book and have been researching Santa Muerte since I first started in 2009.
What have you uncovered about this particular saint?
Oh, I've uncovered so much. She's really a pretty complex figure, and her complexity is captured in her iconography. You see she's got 7 colors. The colors represent different major aspects of the type of miracles that devotees ask for her. So she wears many different hats. Some devotees ask her for miracles of love and passion, and that's the red Santa Muerte. In fact, that's the oldest Santa Muerte we know of. Mexican women in particular asking her to bring back their errant boyfriends or husbands who are behaving badly. The gold Santa Muerte is asking her for favors of prosperity and abundance. The black Santa Muerte is for protection, supernatural protection, or maybe for vengeance against enemies or rivals. The yellow Santa Muerte is for overcoming addiction, drug addiction, and alcoholism. One of the main reasons that her devotion has grown so fast in the past 20 years is because she has developed a reputation for being the speediest and the most efficient, the most efficacious miracle worker on the Mexican religious landscape, and increasingly also here in the United States. I don't know, we're talking about a devotee who's also a devotee of St. Jude, who's the patron of lost causes and is an official canonized Catholic saint. I don't know how many Mexican devotees I've interviewed who told me, you know, I had been a devotee of Jude for a long time. For months, I was asking him for a better job. He never came through. He ignored my petitions. And so a friend of mine said, oh, why not try La Huesuda, the bony lady, a nickname for Santa Muerte? And so I did. I prayed to Santa Muerte, and within a week, I got a much better job. And so countless stories about how Santa Muerte comes through faster and more efficiently with miracles.
Do you think that's why she is so popular?
Yes, that is one of the major reasons. Most of her devotees, not all, but many of these folks, particularly in Mexico, are working class and don't have easy lives. And so they're asking her for miracles that help them cope with difficult circumstances. And you're close to Mexico, so you might know, ongoing terrible narco-related violence, over 200,000 dead over the last decade. Only Syria has had more violent deaths than Mexico in the past decade. And so, a lot of Mexicans fear that death might be just around the corner for them. So some say, who better than to ask for more life, more grains in her hourglass that she holds than death herself. And so it's no coincidence that devotion to Santa Muerte has exploded during a time of lots of bad death in Mexico.
Are Mexicans mainly the demographic? The people I've interviewed, they said that they've seen, Black people starting to become followers of this saint.
Yeah, of the estimated 12 million devotees, probably about 75% are Mexican. This arose in Mexico during the Spanish colonial period. So yeah, the great majority are Mexican. But you're right. If we're talking specifically about the United States, it's a very demographic. There are white, there are African Americans, there's Mexican Americans, there's Puerto Ricans. So in the U.S., it's actually a pretty diverse. I'm on several Facebook groups. There's more than 1,000 Facebook groups for devotees. And most of them are white Americans who don't speak Spanish and maybe have never been to Mexico. There's even European devotees. So yeah, and in just less than 20 years, she's rapidly expanded beyond her base in Mexico. But still, the great majority of devotees are Mexican.
And I'm sorry if you said this already, but where did she originally originate from?
Right. Okay. So she is what we call a syncretism or a fusion of the Spanish Grim Reapers. We're all familiar with the figure of the Grim Reaper, but in Spain and Italy and the Catholic countries of Europe, more often it was a female figure of the Grim Reaper, what I call the Grim Reaperess. So when Spain comes over to conquer and colonize Mexico and the rest of Latin America, the Catholic Church obviously is part of that enterprise, and Catholic priests bring the figure of the Grim Reaperess to evangelize the indigenous people, because they have no idea who the indigenous people are, what their religions are, nothing. So they bring the Grim Reaperess as a tool of evangelization, saying, this is death, this is, what you want to avoid and everything. And unbeknownst to the Spanish Catholics, several groups in Mexico, indigenous groups, already had their own death gods and goddesses, such as the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Mixtecs in Oaxaca. And so when some of these indigenous Mexicans see the Spanish Grim Reaperess, they obviously associate her with their own death goddesses and goddess. And so it's very likely that the Spanish Grim Reaperess, who in Spanish is called La Parca, becomes fused with like the Aztec death goddess Mictecacihuatl, who's the queen of the Aztec underworld called Mictlan. So Santa Muerte is born during the Spanish colonial period in Mexico of this fusion of the Grim Reaperess and indigenous death deities.
That's incredible. I want to talk about her nicknames, because I was reading through some of your work and I noticed that you use several different nicknames for her. I don't know which one is, if there's one that's more accurate than the other, but tell me what nicknames are used for her.
Well, yeah, two of the most common ones, maybe the most common, is La Flaca or La Flaquita, the skinny girl. In fact, there are even Mexican sicarias, or hired cartel killers, who are known as La Flaquita. Also La Huesuda, the bony lady. What else? There is La Dama Poderosa, the powerful lady. An old school one is called La Pelona, the bald lady, because she actually for a long time didn't have any hair. Now you see her with hair of all different rainbow colors and shocking pink and such, but in the beginning she was only bald. La Dientona, the toothy one, because you can see her teeth as a skull and everything. What else? La Niña Bonita, I love that one, the pretty girl. And for a lot of people, when they first see her image, they're like, oh my God, how can you call this skeleton figure pretty? But many devotees see her as not only pretty, but beautiful. So La Niña Bonita. Another interesting one is La Niña Blanca, the white girl. And why white girl? Because obviously if you're nothing but skull and bones, they're white, right? So yeah, those are some, she's got a lot more nicknames, but those are some of the more common ones.
Tell me why the Catholic Church rebukes her.
Yeah, both the Catholic Church and most Protestant churches rebuke her, because their theological argument is that as Christians, Jesus died on the cross just a few days ago, right? Good Friday. to give us the possibility of eternal life. And so the last enemy that was vanquished by Christ was death itself. And so as a Christian, the last thing you should do is to be worshiping death if death is the enemy of Christ. And that's why many Catholic priests and Protestant pastors say it's actually satanic, because if you're worshiping the enemy of Christ, then you are engaging in Satanism, whether you know it or not. So that's kind of the Christian theological argument, but it's also a competition matter, particularly in Mexico. Again, this is the fastest growing new religious movement that goes from just a few thousand devotees back in 2001 to now millions. And so the Catholic Church in Mexico was already in a state of panic over very fast evangelical growth there. And now they have to contend with what they see as this heretical death saint. So it's just more religious competition for them as they've started to lose millions of numbers in the past 20 years or so. So there's also religious competition at play here as well.
I like that, religious competition. So is it fair to say that this is a religion, or is it more cult, or
Well, again, the term that I really like is new religious movement. It hasn't been around long enough to actually call it a religion, but it definitely has aspects of religion. And so I think religious movement is best. And by calling it that instead of a cult, we get away from a lot of the negative popular connotations of using the word cult, because, you know, for most English speakers, if you say cult, you know, you think Charles Manson and all kinds of things. And also, this is too large and too open a practice to call it a cult. And people aren't spirited away in secret centers and things like that, as you imagine happening with so-called cults. So I think religious movement, new religious movement, is a much better term than cult.
okay, good to know. So the gentleman that I had interviewed, he said that when I asked him, so when people ask you, you know, what is your faith? What is your religion? He said that he identifies himself having multiple faiths. So he'll tell people that he's a Catholic, Santa Muerte, and then I believe he used one other term, but I don't remember. But him and his wife just say what they preach is just a mashup of traditional Catholicism and indigenous magic. Is it common for people who are followers of Santa Muerte to identify, I guess, what multiple faiths?
Yeah, can I ask, is he Mexican or Mexican American or?
So he said that he was European and Indian.
Uh-huh.
His wife is Mexican, though. She's from
Okay.
Mexico, and
Okay.
she grew up Catholic. He did too. I don't know particular if she still practices Catholicism, but I know he said he does.
Okay. Well, most Mexican devotees still see themselves as Catholic, and either they don't care that the church condemns Santa Muerte, or maybe they haven't heard. Remember, again, most of these folks are working class. They don't have a lot of time to be reading the papers and keeping up with news. So they might not even know that their local priests or bishops have condemned Santa Muerte. So yeah, most will tell you they're still Catholic. And you know, many of the prayers to Santa Muerte mention Jesus and the Virgin Guadalupe and such. And so for most of them, it's not that they're entirely exclusive. A lot of their Santa Muerte devotion is based on Catholic prayers and rituals. But I would say here in the US, there's more folks who don't necessarily involve Santa Muerte in her Mexican Catholic background because they themselves were never Catholic. And so they might have more of a pagan, neo-pagan, or New Age approach to Santa Muerte. So yeah, I mean, there are folks who exclusively worship Santa Muerte, but there are others who also might ask the Virgin or Jesus for prayers as well.
So I want you to talk again just about St. Jude. So like I was saying earlier, the guy was, angry that St. Jude is recognized, Santa Muerte isn't. What are the differences, I guess, between the two?
Right. So St. Jude Thaddeus is the patron of lost causes, and he is the most popular Catholic saint in Mexico and among Latinos and Latinas here in the United States. He only starts to become popular in Mexico in the 1980s. Kind of interestingly, he was already a narco saint in Colombia. So it's the Colombian narcos who bring him to Mexico City in the 1980s. And that's when he starts to take off in Mexico City. I know this because I've interviewed the rector of the main temple, San Hipólito in Mexico City, where they do not only an annual St. Jude feast day, but one every month on the 28th day of every month. So the church has kind of put St. Jude out there as so he's an official Catholic saint, put him out there as kind of an edgy Catholic alternative to Santa Muerte. Because St. Jude has a robust following among marginalized youth in Mexico. If you go to his monthly fiesta in Mexico City, you can see young guys smoking weed, maybe even huffing glue with their big St. Jude statues. And so the church knows that. And, to some extent, St. Jude is even a narco saint. I mean, you'll see some of these altars in narco safe houses, both in Texas and of course, even more in Mexico. And St. Jude might be on the altar along with Santa Muerte. And that's even more of a problem for the church, right? Because he's their most popular Catholic saint, right? So what do they do about that? But they have put him out there to try to compete with Santa Muerte as an edgy alternative. But a lot of people see them, not as rivals, but have them on the same altar, particularly those who are also Santa Muerte devotees.
Okay, that's really interesting. That is really interesting.
Yeah, I've actually written a couple articles about that. I can send it to you. St. Jude versus Santa Muerte.
Yeah, no, I read the article too that you shared this morning. I'm like reading everything and anything. I just want to make sure
Good for you. Get it right.
Yeah, no, definitely. Let me see. And so this book that you had mentioned early on, it's basically does it go, I read a little bit of it, but does it just go through each color of what Santa Muerte can do?
My book?
Yeah,
my book. Yeah, I actually organized the chapters, as you can see here, by the different colors, which are the main type of miracles and topics of devotion. So yeah, so the black chapter is mostly looking at her role as a narco saint. The red chapter as a love doctor. And that's really important. I mean, last time I checked, her #1 selling votive candle in Mexico was the red candle of love and passion. So while the media often portrays her as the Black Santa Muerte narco saint, even more importantly, she's La Niña Roja, the lady in red, right?
there you go. Gonna get myself unmuted. That's what they're saying at the Botanica too, is that red is like their top seller. So it's
okay, good to hear that.
Yeah. I think I have 2 more questions, but I mean, would you say she gets a bad rep, right? But there's a lot of people that like her. I mean, who's right or wrong here? Is anybody right or wrong?
At the end of the day, it kind of depends what you believe or don't believe. One of the reasons she also gets a bad rap and also gets into trouble with Christians is because she's a folk saint, right? I mean, she's not the only folk saint in Mexico. Have you heard of Jesus Malverde? He's like the original narco saint from Sinaloa. You might want to check him out. But there's all these folk saints in Mexico and Latin America who people worship, but they're not recognized by the Catholic saint. And many times they're more popular than Catholic saints because most of them were real Latin American men and women who actually lived. Santa Muerte is an exception. She wasn't, because she's seen as death herself. But many times, as you know, most of these thousands of Catholic saints were Europeans, and they died centuries ago. So sometimes Mexicans, Argentines, Brazilians aren't going to find Europeans who died 700 years ago necessarily so relevant, right, to their modern Mexican reality or Brazilian reality. And so these folk saints are seen as much more approachable and kind of much more like them. So folk saints are not immoral, but they're amoral, meaning you can ask them pretty much for anything you want to. So if you are a Mexican cartel and you want your shipment of, what are we going to say, fentanyl, terrible fentanyl, to make it safely to San Antonio, you can legitimately ask Santa Muerte to bless your shipment. Maybe she will, maybe she won't, I don't know. But you can do that because she's not a Christian, a Catholic saint. Whereas you should not be asking a Catholic saint to do immoral things, right? And so these amoral folk saints have that kind of special niche marketing where you can ask them to do anything. For example, if you have an enemy or rival that you would like to have silenced, you can ask them to do that. I don't know if they're going to come through and do it. That's up to the devotee and Santa Muerte, whoever. But you should not be asking Catholic saints to do dirty deeds, right? Immoral acts. And so that often leads to kind of a demonization of Santa Muerte and these folk saints. The fact that some folks ask them for what Christians might see as dark deeds.
And I think my last question is, as far as the future goes, where do you see Santa Muerte going? Do you see more people following her? What does the future look like in your?
Well, this is the last question I should be weighing in on because I'm a historian, right? So I don't like to get a crystal ball out, but I will do it for you, Sarah, my crystal ball. Yeah, I mean, given the fact that her growth has just been explosive since she goes public in Mexico City in 2001, and that the condemnations by the Catholic Church and evangelical churches has done nothing to slow the growth, I only see continued rapid growth. And one of the reasons too is because in some ways, she kind of looks super Mexican, right? Here she is, Aztec Santa Muerte. But even most Mexican devotees will tell you, death has no nationality. How can you say that death is Mexican? Death has no nationality. And so that makes her appeal universal, right? In fact, you can see her little globe that she has representing her dominion over planet Earth. And so that's why also quickly she has devotees of all different nationalities. Because even though she's arises in Mexico, death has no nationality. Death, with her size, she crosses across borders. I don't think she liked Trump's idea of putting up a wall. So she has a universal appeal as death herself. Plus, she starts to become popular as social media takes off, right? And like Mexicans live on Facebook. Mexicans are number 5 in the world in Facebook presence. And so, there's hundreds and hundreds of Facebook groups where people share their photos of Santa Muerte, they exchange prayers, rituals, and everything. So social media and especially Facebook and maybe WhatsApp too, for Mexicans in particular, is a really important source of her spreading her growth as well, because people get together and can share across borders.
That's so crazy. Is there anything else that I didn't ask that you think I should know, or anything else you would like to expand on? I'll give you the floor.
Yeah, I'm glad in particular that you're doing this story, because the two states where Santa Muerte has the greatest presence in the country are Texas and California. And San Antonio, along with Houston and Dallas, would have some of the largest number of Santa Muerte devos in the entire country. A few years ago, we did a documentary with Texas Folk Life, and we actually did one of the premieres in San Antonio, Austin as well. And you've been to Botanicas there. So yeah, I mean, this is especially important for folks in Texas, because she has such a large presence there as well. So I'm really glad that you're doing this story in particular.